Angela Smith, 19, Keene State College sophomore.
My name is Allison Tomiso. I'm 25 years old and I am a PE teacher.
My name is Abby Hoy. I am 19 and I am a Keene State student.
I'm Christopher Smith. I am 43 and I'm the principal at St. Joseph Regional School.
I'm Cindy Hoy, H-O-Y-E. I'm 58, I have to think a moment, and I'm a second grade teacher here, and I'm also the director of the child care program.
On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say I'm a 7.
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would give myself a 5.
On a good day, probably 7. On a bad day, probably 4.
Boy, I would think I'm a 9, at least.
On a scale from 1 to 10, I think that I am about a 9.
I use technology to meet up with friends, do homework for school, and just make life easier.
Every day I have my phone with me, so I use, I go on Facebook, check Facebook. I use my iPad at school for grading and using different apps for some of my PE classes, so I use technology, I guess, almost every day.
I use technology to check weather updates, traffic updates, social networking, and classes.
I constantly use my mobile phone, I guess, for everything. Scheduling, reading email, talking on the phone, always using it, yeah.
In my everyday life is email for work here. I also use technology, the cell phone a lot. We use the Safari for that, for location of different venues or places, things we might want to go to. I use the texting very frequently with my family.
I would use technology differently for work as more typing rather than just fooling around, I guess.
For fun, I'm usually using my phone, text people on Facebook, Snapchat. For school, work, I'm usually using it for grading or looking up things to teach.
I'm not sure that I use it so much differently for work. I use email instead of texting. I suppose I still look up things for work here, different methods of teaching, different activities to teach a different subject, something to sort of spice it up a little. I think that I use a printer more often here because I print it out for my class.
My life would be different without modern technology because it would just be harder to communicate with friends and meet up with people and just do things.
It'd be interesting. My life would be interesting if I didn't have access to technology. I guess I'd feel a little disconnected from people, maybe. It'd probably make my job a lot harder if I didn't have technology. Because I get a lot of my teaching ideas from different PE websites and things like that. So I think it'd make things a little difficult.
Honestly, I think my life would be way better. I think that I'd be able to focus more on the people and the things around me as opposed to other stuff going on in other countries that doesn't pertain to my life.
I would be very sad. No, I'm just very used to having my cell phone and always being able to make decisions, and because I know I have that piece of technology, I can't imagine not having it anymore.
I think I would be a better typist and probably a better speller because I wouldn't have, it wouldn't be so easy to correct those mistakes. How would life be? Well, I grew up without a lot of technology, so to speak, and it certainly makes life easier. So I think that without it, it would be more difficult and challenging and tedious. You can get a lot done in a much shorter amount of time.
I think technology has a disadvantage to learning because I feel like you can't get the same feel from reading off a screen as opposed to reading off paper or a book. And I also feel like it's distracting, so your brain can't focus on one thing at once.
I think that it impacts learning in a multitude of ways. I think that students, I have noticed that when they are on the computer for lengthy amount of time, or they're frustrated by it or even excited by it, it's very difficult for them to let it go and just change directions into something else. I find it creates a certain amount of frustration or excitement physically within them, so that it carries over into a lot of different dimensions. However, that being said, I also think it opens up a humongous opening for them to discover and look up and use for so many different ways. So I think that they're really fortunate to have it at this time.
So I think that's an interesting question. So I think that the technology itself shouldn't be part of the learning experience. So if technology can help students learn, that's wonderful. But I don't think it's worth just using technology in order to create a learning experience. So the students will use they use computers or Chromebooks to write papers and do research and that kind of thing. The teachers may use like a projector, but we don't use touch screens, and there's no smart boards here, so it's a lot of chalkboard, whiteboard environment. Sometimes they like to explore things perhaps that they shouldn't, or there are times when they'll rather, instead of writing their paper, they'll try to play a game on it, but really nothing dramatic, I guess. I think that it's important that they understand, what kind of information they're getting, and then also, especially more so maybe in the last few years, that they understand where their information is coming from, and that is it a reliable source or isn't it a reliable source. That's our main focus. One thing we do teach when doing research is, where's your research coming from?